Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right, I'm starting the lecture. Yes, Alan, do you have a question?
Good morning. I have a quick question.
Mhm.
The the name was Sonar, I believe, correct? Or Sona.
Sona, Sona.
So I signed up, I got it,
Okay.
and this is gonna be like for future classes, it's gonna be more of like how's it gonna look like?
Oh
I'm
no, this is a one-time thing. It's only for this semester.
oh, okay.
It's only for this semester because in this semester you have to participate in research as one credit of your course.
Okay.
Okay, so it's only for this one.
All right, thank
Yes,
you.
you're welcome. Yes, Tommy?
I was gonna ask, so my CUNY email, like I've had trouble with it and like I went to IT and like
Mm-hmm.
they haven't been able to help me. And I tried to put like my personal email as my primary one for the school.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible I could sign up for Sona with my personal email or no?
Yeah,
You'll have
that's
to
what I did.
try. If you were able to do it on Brightspace, you should be able to do it for Sona as well.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah, somewhere it has to be registered.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Um, Arman?
Oh yes, thank you, Professor. I want to ask for I think yesterday, last Monday, I forgot about it. For attendance, you take it now or the end of
No,
the class?
no, I'll tell you sometime in the middle of class.
And put our name in the chat. Okay,
Yeah. Okay. All
thank you.
right. You're welcome. Abigail?
Yes, hello, Professor. I just wanted to ask real quickly. The SONA research participation is for all students or just psychology majors?
Well, your voice is breaking. Can you repeat that?
Yes, well, I'm not sure, but is the SONA participation thing all majors need to do, or just psychology?
Anyone taking this course?
All right. Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
because this is a 4 credit course. 1 credit is your research participation. So it doesn't matter whether you're a psychology major or not. If you're taking this course, you have to complete the research participation. Okay, who else? Is that all? Okay, let's continue then. So we're going to be doing the second part of the first chapter. Okay, so let's see what we have here. This is what we're going to be learning about. So, first is a brief history of psychology, like how it changed from a philosophical view to a scientific view. Then we're going to be looking at some questions that are still of importance to psychologists. Now, these questions are being dealt by psychologists who take different perspectives. So they would be called the major schools of thought in psychology. So we need to know that. So you see, as a psychology major, one, you should know the definition of psychology. Two, you must know what the major schools of thought are. That means within psychology, we have psychologists who have teamed up in support of one particular view of human behavior and mental processes. So we have different schools of thought. Now, as you also graduate, say you get a PhD, you start doing research, you will also start thinking that you probably prefer to affiliate with one of these schools of thought. So then you are added to that school. Okay, so we have some major schools of thought in psychology. They all have evidence in support of them. So that's why they still exist. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just that they're focusing on different angles of human behavior, and they have evidence in support of their own theories. Recognize how historical approaches continue to influence modern psychology. So this is also important. When you know about the history of psychology, you also need to know from those old views what exactly has continued up until now. So there are some of these people who were philosophers, early psychologists. They said a lot of things about psychology. Maybe most of it, has changed. Most of it is not acceptable now, but maybe something that they said still continues to be important. So we need to know that. We need to credit those people for that important point that they added to psychology. Understand the contributions of key psychologists and the progression of ideas. So this whole thing is meant for this last sentence here. So when you know about the history, you actually come to know who the important people were in the history of psychology, what exactly did they give us, and how their ideas have developed and become something else now. So we're going to start with this. When we say that psychology was philosophical, all disciplines, began with philosophy, whether it's physics, chemistry, because back in those days, look at the years here, 400 BC, 300 BC, that means before Christ. So it's not even in our time to say it's not 80. So those days, 300, 400 years before Christ, you can imagine they had nothing. They had no ways of measuring things. So all they did was to talk and discuss. That's why they're called philosophers, because they talked, they debated, they discussed about things. So these two philosophers are well known in almost every discipline, Plato and Aristotle. Plato believed in biology. So he believed in nature. That is, he thought everything is biological. We are born with, something. He didn't talk about the brain or anything, but he believed that there's something that we are born with, and we have the knowledge. But what did Aristotle say? Aristotle said, no, when we are born, we have nothing. In fact, this blank slate, tabula rasa, is, a phrase that came to be repeated over and over again. And it's through experience that we accumulate knowledge. So these were the oldest philosophers. They had no ways to measure, as I said, but after 2,000 years, imagine, for 2,000 years, it was just philosophy. Gradually, after about 2,000 years, is when every science broke away from philosophy, including psychology. Who was responsible? So you can see two names that are important. Wundt in Germany is credited because he established the first laboratory in psychology. So he's considered the founder of scientific psychology. He's the person who said that, well, if you want to understand human behavior, no, we have to do it scientifically. We need to have a lab. And he believed, so he set up the first school of psychology called structuralism. He believed that the mind determines behavior. And if we are able to understand the structure of the mind, if we are able to understand what exactly the mind is made up of, and what did he think is the mind? He thought it's consciousness, whatever we are aware of. So whatever we are aware of is the mind, and that's what determines our behaviors. So if we can study what we're aware of, psychology is a science. And how can we study what we are aware of? He said, well, he introduced the method which he called analytic introspection. He would train people in his lab and show them various stimuli and ask them what exactly comes to their mind when they see those stimuli. And what are the stimuli that he used? Everyday objects. Like, say, he would produce an orange, show an orange to these trained participants, tell them just to focus on the orange and to say what goes through their mind. What is it they become aware of? And he thought that there would be something common across all these people. And that's how he would be able to understand the mind. Unfortunately, this school of thought failed because even though he trained his participants, each one came up with different things when they were looking at the same stimulus. So say looking at an orange, looking at an apple, some things were common. People would say the color, for instance, or the shape. But then people would also say other things, like one would say delicious. One would say eating. Another who didn't like it would not say these words. So he found so much of variation in the responses that people produce. He wasn't able to come up with, or he wasn't able to put them together to come up with one explanation. So his school failed. Almost as a contemporary of Wundt was William James. James was in the United States at Harvard. So he came up with the second school of psychology called functionalism. He was influenced by Darwin's theory. So Wundt came up with this theory before Darwin, but James came up with a theory after Darwin's theory. And what did Darwin say? Darwin's theory, which is accepted, is that the theory of evolution, saying that all species evolve over time, and the human beings too. And that genes that help survival, they are the genes that are transmitted to later generations. So genes that help survival, that mean genes that serve a purpose. So James took on that idea and thought that, well, if you want to study human behavior, it's best that we study the purpose of human behavior. We have to see what is it that people try to achieve by doing different things. So that's how he said the function of human behavior is important. Now, regardless of these two schools, what's important is in 1879, when the laboratory was established by Wundt, psychology was no more philosophy, and it became a science, with the first scientific method being analytic introspection, or just introspection. So now the second thing we said, we're going to be looking at the questions that psychologists still try to answer. These are debates in psychology. The first is nature versus nurture. That's clear. Is biology more important? Is heredity more important in determining behavior, or no? Are our experiences more important? The second question, when people behave, how much of their behavior is attributable to their own intentions? Do we have control over our behavior, or no? Is our behavior totally determined by external factors? So that's the debate between free will and determinism. Accuracy versus inaccuracy. If we believe that our mind processes information, then does our mind process information accurately and objectively, or no? Do each of us differ in the way we process the same information? So there's nothing called accuracy. It's inaccurate. It's not objective information that we process, It's very subjective. Another question is, how aware are we of the reasons for our behaviors? That would be, how conscious are we? And do unconscious elements also feature while determining our behavior? So again, you'll see we've had psychologists who completely believe that unconscious elements are important. We have others who believe that no, we should not focus on the unconscious. Our behavior is completely conscious. Differences and similarities. So when we study people, well, we think that we are all humans, so we should be similar in many ways. How similar are we? And how different are we? Are our similarities more than our differences? So that's another question. So you can see that at any point in time, psychologists have always been concerned with these 5 questions. So when we talk about the different schools of psychology, the schools of psychology also depend on how they tackle these questions. So the first school of psychology was structuralism. As I told you, we don't need to go into these details. So Wundt was the founder, and the technique he used was introspection. Now, we said we're going to look and see what exactly has continued from Wundt up until now. Well, the fact that psychology is a science, we owe that to Wundt. If we have labs today, well, we owe that to Wundt. So the first psychology lab was established by Wundt. Second, he showed us that we can measure mental processes. If today we measure empathy, we measure loneliness, it's because the idea came from Wundt. And an important point is he showed us that there's a difference between sensation and perception. Sensation is what our sense organs pick up. So he found that when he shows an apple to people, some people say delicious, but some people don't. What is that? So that's a perception. It's not sensation. Our sense organs don't pick up something as delicious. But when people say it's round, red, that is sensation. So he told us, or he showed us, that sensation and perception are 2 different things. He may have failed for these reasons that you see here. Or in other words, that introspection is very subjective, and so it will not help us arrive at the results that we want. But that's okay. You can see what we carry on, what we carried over from Wundt up until today. Functionalism, as I said, William James's school of thought, well, that focused more on the purpose of human behavior, the function of human behavior. And what was the logic there? As I said, everything that we experience in our minds has a purpose. Consciousness, well, if we are conscious, we are aware of things, it's because it helps survival. If we have memory, it's because it again serves a purpose. It helps us remember experiences so that we don't have to experience the same thing over and over again. We know how to deal with situations. Fear, anger, these emotions. Why do we experience emotions? They probably serve some purpose. They probably, again, aid survival, or they aid reproduction. So that was Darwin's theory carried over into psychology. So this was functionalism. Okay, there's an example here about jealousy. which even today evolutionary psychologists believe in that. Why do people feel jealous? Well, they feel jealous, especially about their partners, because they feel that they might be losing their partner. So in order to protect their partner, they feel jealous. So, and that again, it may not add to survival, but it adds to the success or possibility of reproduction. So it's either reproductive success or survival. It is survival for reproduction, because if you survive, then you reproduce, your genes get transmitted to the next generation. That was Darwin's theory, and James also used that to explain why we engage in different behaviors. Okay, so these are the key figures here. What from James's theory still exists today? So, well, he explained why psychological features exist. That's why we have evolutionary psychology. He connected psychology and biology. So he was responsible for using Darwin's theory. Darwin was a biologist. So James's theory connected psychology and biology. Like Wundt, he also, came up with a theory, but James's theory was important because it was more like a scientific theory. You could generate hypotheses and test them out. And James, like Darwin, made a statement that was not applicable only to human behavior, but it could be applied to behaviors in animals too. Well, it did have problems. It was hard to test because when you talk about genes and you say, well, these genes have survived because they helped survival, they helped reproduction, how can you go back and test that? So also with behaviors, how can you test that? If a person feels jealous, it is to ensure reproductive success. So even though the theory itself generates some testable hypotheses, there are other hypotheses that come from the theory but are not easy to test. Prone to hindsight bias. That means it's more like you're saying something after you see it. Hindsight just means after the outcome, you're assuming that something happened. Now, because some people are alive, you're assuming that, oh, it's because, they have the genes that kept them alive. Or if they do something and then it turns out to be successful, after the outcome, you say that, oh, they have the genes for it. So it's difficult to test. That's the main thing, but you can see that it left behind a lot of positives for us. The third school of thought was psychodynamic psychology. It's a third school of thought, but in psychology, it's considered the first force in psychology. Why do we call it the first force? Because this is when psychology became very comprehensive. Psychodynamic school began with Freud. So Freud revolutionized the entire way we think about human behavior. He introduced the concept of the unconscious. He introduced the idea that our childhood experiences are important even for our adult behavior. So we call Freudian theory the first force in psychology because Freudian theory, Freudian way of thinking spread so quickly that it became a paradigm. What does a paradigm mean? Paradigm just means a dominant way of thinking. That means Freudian ideas just took over psychology. Everybody studying psychology suddenly became a Freudian. Freud focused on the unconscious mind, and he said that no, we are not aware of everything that we do because the causes of behavior in adulthood lie in the unconscious. The unconscious elements come from childhood experiences. We don't remember what we experienced in childhood, but whatever we experienced, all the emotions that we experienced, everything is there in our unconscious, and it affects our adult personality. So when he came up with this, he continued to expand his ideas to include not only just normal everyday behavior, but also to talk about problem behaviors. So while he included problem behaviors, he came up with an idea for therapy. He said, okay, so if people are experiencing problems like depression, anxiety, the causes are in the unconscious, so the only way they can be treated is if the unconscious contents can be brought to consciousness. The moment people become aware of them, then their health will improve. So what he said made a lot of sense to people. Freudian ideas ruled psychology and the world for about 60 years. 6 decades is not a small amount of time. That's why his ideas are called the first force in psychology. Gradually, towards the end, of course, people broke away from Freud as, like science developed. Jung and Adler were very close associates of Freud, but they broke away with Jung focusing more on the unconscious and Adler focusing on the conscious. So probably we do have in chapter 2, we're going to be looking at their theories in depth. So right now, all you need to know is that they were associates of Freud, but they broke away. They had their disagreements with Freud about different things. Freud was very adamant. He never accepted any kind of opposition. And so he just broke away from these people. He's the one who just threw them out of his school. And then came Erikson. You can see Erikson came much later. Erikson just modified one aspect of Freudian theory. So Freud talked about stages of development, but in Freud's stages of development, he talked about instincts. Erikson also talked about stages of development. What Erikson did was he expanded the stages all the way up until adulthood. And instead of talking about instincts, he spoke about social conflicts. So these are theories that we're going to be looking into in detail. Right now, you just need to know those names. So going back to Freud, Freud came up with a therapy, and his therapy is what resulted in what we call talk therapy even today. What is psychotherapy? The therapist talks to the client. How did that happen at all? It's Freud, because Freud believed that through talking to clients, to getting clients vent, talk about their problems, that his technique was called free association. So Freud believed that in getting people to talk about their problems, the more they talk, gradually from consciousness, they will enter the unconscious mind, and the elements of the unconscious will become conscious. He also believed that by analyzing dreams, like today we hear of people talking about their dreams. They say, oh, I dreamt about this. I wonder what it means. Or, oh, I dreamt about this. It was strange. We talk about our dreams now. Who focused on dreams? Again, it was Freud, right? Or the idea that childhood experiences are very important and that they influence behavior in adulthood. So these are all things that we got from Freud. So Freud's ideas were very, very different from those of his predecessors like James and Wundt. So that's the reason why Freud's school of thought became a very dominant school of thought. Okay, so what are the problems with Freudian theory? Well, when we go into Freudian theory in depth, you'll see that there are many concepts that Freud talked about that are very hard to test scientifically. Like he talked about parts of the personality, he talked about the mind being divided into 3 levels. He talked about the unconscious, the preconscious, conscious. Well, you can't test them scientifically. You either just accept it or you can't test them. But then in science, we believe that every theory should be testable. We should be able to falsify every theory. But Freudian theory is not falsifiable. How do you, for instance, test that, yes, the child did have, problems with the mother, or that the mother was not responsive in somebody's childhood? There's no way you can test that. It's something that you're assuming now after the person has become an adult. So that's the reason why Freudian theory was criticized. Some of the reasons. Of course, the reason why Freudian theory came to be abandoned is only because psychology insisted on being a science and only focusing on measurable concepts. But what did Freud leave behind for us? So the fact or the idea that there are unconscious processes that determine our behavior, that is something that we owe to Freud. The fact that our early experiences do impact our current experiences, that therapy is effective. So these are things that we owe to Freud, even though several of his, specific ideas have not been replicated or have not been verified. The second force in psychology is behaviorism. So behaviorism came as a reaction to Freudian theory, but Freudian theory, as I said, ruled for 60 years. When behaviorism came to be proposed, the main idea that they had was that if psychology is to continue as a science, we have to be objective. That means we can't rely on things that are invisible. We can't focus on the mind like Wundt said, because elements of the mind are not visible, are not testable. We cannot focus on the unconscious, as Freud said, because there's no way we can measure things in the unconscious. If psychology is a science, we have to focus only on observable behavior. So that's how behaviorism came into existence. Well, a lot of people did move away from Freud and join the behavioristic school. So behaviorists believed that in the environment there are stimuli that our mind responds to. So what we see as a behavior in people can actually be described as a response to a stimulus in the environment. And so if we identify these stimulus-response relationships, we will be able to predict human behavior. So that was the main behavioristic idea. How did they arrive at this idea? So when we talk about behaviorism, the founder is a person called Watson. Watson actually put ideas of other people together. The first idea that he adopted was the idea of Pavlov. Pavlov was a Russian. And he was a physiologist. He was doing research on saliva of dogs. So he had dogs and he was, like measuring their saliva, doing some research with saliva. He happened to notice that every time he entered the room where the cages were kept, the dogs were in cages, when he turned the light on to feed the dogs, before feeding the dogs would salivate. You see, it can happen to us too. Like if you're hungry now, you haven't had breakfast, if you think of something delicious, your mouth may water. So he found the dog salivating, and he was a researcher, so he was very observant. And he wondered why the dogs are salivating when he hadn't given them food yet. And he connected it to the light coming on. So he did that a couple of times, and he discovered that, yes, the dogs were salivating to the light coming on. He changed the light into a bell, and he found that they started salivating to the bell. So that's how he came up with what is called the principle of classical conditioning. He said that these dogs had learned to make a connection between that stimulus, which was neutral, like the bell or the light, with the food that was to be presented shortly after. So they made a connection and they started predicting. So he believed that, well, if dogs were doing that, then probably human beings do such things too. So he was a physiologist and he only talked about his dogs. But Watson picked up the idea and said that, well, if this can happen to dogs, it probably happens to human beings too. Salivating is a biological response. So here you can see before learning, the bell or the light was just a neutral stimulus. Dogs were not showing any response to it. But because it started being paired with food, and food was resulting in salivation, the dogs had learned to connect the bell also to food, and so they started salivating. Now, so the terms that are used in classical conditioning are these. They're important for you to know. So any stimulus that can naturally cause a response in us is called an unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned just means learned. So it's unlearned. There are many things that we naturally respond to. They're all unlearned stimuli. We don't have to learn. Just being human, we respond in a particular way to those stimuli. For instance, if it's a wild animal, we just feel fear. We don't have to learn that an animal is dangerous. Naturally, we feel fear. If there's a loud noise, again, we may get startled. That's again natural. So these kind of stimuli are called unlearned, unconditioned stimuli because inherently, naturally, they have the ability to elicit a response in us. The response itself is also unlearned. It's out of our control. It's natural. It's physiological. So we call it an unconditioned or unlearned response. But anything else that is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, like in this instance, the bell or the light, that would be called a conditioned stimulus because by itself, it wasn't able to trigger any response. Only through association, it began to trigger a response. And if we start responding to this neutral stimulus, our response, even though it's a biological response, we would call it a conditioned response. So these are the terms that are used in classical conditioning. Now, what Watson did was Watson used Pavlov's theory and applied it to human beings. So he said, well, salivating is a biological response, but there are so many other responses. Watson came up with the idea that probably our emotional responses. There are many things that make us happy. Food, creates salivation in dogs, maybe also in human beings. There are also certain things that may be disgusting, just like there are certain foods that we don't like, and we show probably not salivation, but a disgust response towards it. There are stimuli that can create fear in us. Fear is also a biological response. We don't have to learn it. So you can see Watson expanded it to include many other emotional responses: anger, fear, love. And you will see later on that there was an experiment that Watson did with a little boy called Albert, a 9-month-old baby. He showed how he could create fear in the baby. So what he did was he gave the baby, like a toy rabbit, and the baby would just play with it, a 9-month-old baby. After the baby would play with it, so the rabbit was something positive for the baby, he started his experiment. He gave the toy rabbit to the baby, and he immediately sounded a loud noise, loud enough to create a startle in the baby. So the baby got startled and started crying. So Watson did this every time he presented that toy rabbit to the baby. And the baby started showing a fear towards the rabbit because the baby connected that loud noise to the rabbit. And then Watson changed it. Instead of the rabbit, he gave another furry animal showed another furry animal to the baby. Even before the loud noise was sounded, the moment the baby would see the other furry animal, the baby would start crying. In other words, the baby was now showing a conditioned response. And Watson had conditioned fear. So that's how Watson set up the School of Behaviorism and said, well, we learn things. Everything is learned. Everything is just a response to things that happen in the environment. So one part of it was our unlearned responses learned through association. But behaviorism included another principle of learning too. So learning and conditioning mean the same. The second learning principle was actually was suggested by a person called Thorndike, but expanded by Skinner. So we talk a lot about Skinner in the context of behaviorism because Skinner did a lot of experiments and came up with a lot of information regarding how consequences of our behaviors are important. When you do something, if you experience a positive consequence, the possibility of you repeating the behavior increases. But if you do something and the consequence is negative, then the possibility of the behavior being repeated is reduced. So here are some examples that you can see. If a child does things that their parent asks them to do, the parent may reward the child. Say the child gets allowance. Now the child is happy. The child has got an allowance. So the child is more likely to repeat doing the chores. So also if the child does something that displeases parents, like talking back, maybe screen time is reduced, maybe the phone is taken away. Now that is experienced as a negative consequence. So the next time the child feels like talking back, the child may think twice and may not engage in talking back because the child knows that they're going to be losing something if they do so. Right? So this today seems very ordinary and very clear to us. But those days, when it was first mentioned, first by Thorndike and then expanded by Skinner, it was something new because they were learning about human behavior and they expanded it. So they used these two principles. They said, well, all emotions are learned through classical conditioning, pairing of two stimuli. If you look at a friend and you smile, your smile comes naturally. You're not putting on an intentional smile. If you smile naturally, it's because the sight of your friend is now connected, associated with the good times you spent with the friend. Having a party, spending a good time naturally creates positive feelings in you. But the people, like say you enjoy have a good time with your friends in a restaurant. The next time you pass by the restaurant, you immediately think positive. Everything about the restaurant is positive for you now, even though you just visited it once. Why? Because you're connecting it with the good time you had. So that's one aspect of learning. The second aspect is things that we do. So that's why it's called operant conditioning. Operant means we do things, while classical conditioning explains biological responses. Operant conditioning explains voluntary responses. Why do you do things? Why do you go to class? Why are you doing certain things? Is because you're expecting certain positive consequences. So initially, behaviorism was made up of these two principles: classical conditioning, operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, we have the terms unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. In operant conditioning, we have the terms stimulus, and the consequences are called reinforcement or punishment. Reinforcement is anything that increases the behavior in future. So it strengthens the behavior. That's why it's called reinforcement. Punishment is anything that decreases behavior. Now, with reinforcement and punishment also, we can have positive and negative. Positive reinforcement is when something positive is given to the person for having engaged in a behavior. Negative reinforcement is when something negative is taken away from the person. So say you do something nice and your parents say, okay, now that you did something nice, you don't have to do the dishes today. So say it was your turn to do the dishes, it was your turn to take the trash out, but because you did something nice, parents are rewarding you by relieving you of something negative. So that's something positive, but because they're relieving you of something negative, it's called negative reinforcement. Now, students usually confuse between negative reinforcement because they think negative reinforcement means it should be something negative. Remember, here the word reinforcement is important. So reinforcement means something positive. The consequence is positive. So if you say negative reinforcement, it just means that something negative is being taken away from you. So, like for instance, if you don't like in-person classes, and if there's a snowfall and they announce saying that, oh, classes are going to be online, so now that's a negative reinforcement. You're happy. Why? Because you don't have to commute now. Punishment can also be positive or negative. So punishment is, when a negative consequence follows an action. The effect is that the person is less likely to do what they were doing because now they experienced something negative. Again, punishment also can be positive or negative. If it's positive, it means something negative is being given to the person. So say if you do something and then say you drive too fast and you get a ticket. That's a punishment. You're getting a ticket. But then if your driving license is taken away because of some violation, that's now a negative punishment. Negative punishment. Why? Because a privilege is being taken away from you. Something that you prefer is being taken away from you. So remember, taking away is negative. Giving is positive. So when you do something nice, if you get a positive consequence, you get something, it's just called positive reinforcement. If something negative is taken away from you, something positive is taken away from you, it's called negative reinforcement. Taking away is negative. So also with punishment. Now, you see, today we know that punishing children with positive punishment is not a good idea. Scolding children, punishing them physically, they're not considered good, but instead, negative punishment is advisable. Taking things away, reducing their screen time, taking away their phones, taking away the opportunity to have a sleepover. These are better punishments for children. Why? Because these are negative punishments. You take away something desirable from the child, seems to be milder than giving the child positive punishments. So these are the terms used in operant conditioning. The behavior itself is called an operant. The consequence, if overall desirable, is called reinforcement. If overall undesirable, is called punishment. Both can be positive or negative. People to remember from the behaviorism school: Pavlov, who proposed classical conditioning; Watson, who established the school of behaviorism and did the experiment with the little baby. His experiment is called the Little Albert experiment. And then Skinner, who elaborated operant conditioning. What about behaviorism is good? Well, behaviorism established or strengthened psychology as a science. Wundt established it as a science, but wasn't able to do much. The people who actually firmly established it as a science are the behaviorists, because they believed in objective measurement. They came up with principles of learning, principles that came to be applied. You see, when I said that children are better punished using negative punishment, well, we owe it to behaviorists who told us that. So in education now, why do people get degrees, grades? All these grades are again consequences. They are things that we learned from behaviorism. So you can see that principles of behaviorism, principles of learning, are now applied in almost every area of life. Promotions, a job. What is that? That's again a positive consequence. Suspension. If you do something, you can be suspended, right? That's a punishment. So all these punishments and rewards, they came from the behavioristic school. So behaviorism had an impact on almost every area of human life. The hypotheses that they came up with are testable, they can be replicated. So that's important. They can be replicated means that's, again, it's transparent. That helps because to be scientific means to come up with theories that can be tested by others. The problem with behaviorism, or the reason why, so this was the second force in psychology. The reason why behaviorism didn't survive as much as the psychodynamic school is because behaviorists ignored the mind. They said everything is just a response to environmental stimuli. That means people don't think, people don't, people's thought processes, people's intentions, people's emotions, they were just being neglected. So it was like human beings are passive, just responding, not agentic, as if human beings do not decide and do anything on their own. They just wait for environmental stimuli to respond to. So gradually, psychologists went against it. And the next school of psychology came into existence, which we will see shortly. But what did we get from behaviorism? So we can see here, learning principles. The most important contribution of the behavioristic school is the learning principles. And based on learning principles, behavior modification therapy. The therapy is still widely used. So when we say behavior modification, it's based on classical conditioning or operant conditioning. So if a person experiences anxiety, we can easily see if the anxiety is being shown towards stimuli that are actually neutral. Like, say, a person has a phobia of using elevators. Behaviorists would explain it as, well, elevators are just neutral stimuli. They got associated with the fear because they got associated with some incident that happened when the person was taking the elevator. So say you were riding the elevator, something happened, like the elevator started maybe shaking or came to a sudden halt. And so you had a bad experience. So now you are avoiding all elevators. So what's the way to treat? Behavior modification. All you need to do is to expose the person to elevators. The person can see that all elevators are not dangerous, nothing terrible is going to happen, and gradually their fear will go away. So behaviorists came up with therapeutic strategies that really work. The focus on environmental influences. You see, before behaviorism, we had Freud. Freud talked about the environment, but he talked about early environment. He said childhood experiences are internalized and they continue to affect behavior. But behaviorists said we don't have to go back to childhood. Look at the environment right now. Current environmental factors influence behavior. But the problem was that they did not talk about the mind. So came the next school of thought, which is cognitive psychology. So cognitivists, gradually psychologists came to realize, no, it's not possible to explain human behavior by just looking at environmental factors. And on the other hand, we had Freudian explanations focusing on the unconscious, but only the unconscious was also not sufficient. So cognitivists said that we need to consider mental processes. We need to consider individual differences. The same environmental situation can trigger different behaviors in people. People interpret the same situation differently. Perceptions are different. Thought processes are different. memories are different, and we are affected by these mental processes. So that's how the cognitive school came into existence. Now, you will be surprised that the idea of computer technology actually came in the 1960s. So researchers who knew about computers then, they started thinking that maybe the mind also works just like a computer. Maybe there are different parts. So first there is an input, data coming into the mind, and then the data being processed, being sent to a memory, and then maybe there's an output when we retrieve that information that is stored in memory. So cognitive psychology came into existence. Today, of course, with advances in technology, we are able to study mental processes. But in general, what cognitivists were proposing those days was that environmental stimuli do not affect all individuals in the same way. People interpret environmental stimuli, so interpretations can be different. So based on the interpretation, we show responses. So that's why individual behaviors can be different. So if you need to explain human behavior, you have to focus on the interpretations people make. So cognitive psychology and the behavioristic view, they teamed up to create what is called the cognitive behavioral school of psychology. Here is just an example. Like, say, if a boy says, "You're so beautiful," to a girl. Now, girls can differ. One girl may interpret it as something positive, as a compliment, and she may, like spend more time with the boy. Now, the behaviorists think of only this aspect. They think that this is just something positive, and so the girl will spend more time with the boy. But cognitivists say no. A girl may come up with that interpretation. Another girl may come up with a different interpretation like this. Another girl may think, "Oh, this boy is trying to manipulate me. What are his intentions?" She may become skeptical, and she may not decide to spend more time with the boy. So that's the difference. Cognitivists said that the interpretation that people make, that's important. When we think of cognitive psychology, so whose name comes to mind? There are certain people, the early cognitivists, one of them is Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus was very clever in designing experiments. He wanted to study memory. So he believed that, what we store in memory determines our behavior, but he was trying to find a way to study memory. He knew that he could not use just normal language or words because they would be very personal. Like, say, the color yellow may have one meaning for you, but a different meaning for someone else. Bag can have one connotation for you, for someone else, a different connotation. So he knew that he could not use regular words that we use in language. So he created lists of nonsense syllables. Again, he did not include vowels because he said even if a vowel is included, people may make connections with that syllable and something in their lives. And those connections can differ. So he created combinations with just consonants, like say C, B, H. It would be difficult to pronounce, difficult to connect it with anything in our everyday lives. He created lists of these syllables, tried to memorize them, and after he had memorized them without any error, he would start measuring his memory. So maybe he would also write down how long it took him to memorize them. So say a list of 10 of these syllables, all combinations of 3 consonants. He would memorize the list in order, and he would time himself and say, for instance, it took, say, 40 minutes to memorize the list. And then he would recall. So the first time, obviously, the recall would be perfect. So after 40 minutes, he was able to recall perfectly. Then he would again test himself after 10 minutes, after 10-minute break. Again, after 30 minutes, after an hour. And he found that his memory became less and less with time. So at the beginning, he was able to remember all those nonsense combinations. But with the passage of time, like after 20 minutes, he remembered less. After 1 hour, even less. After 1 day, much less. And he did this multiple times. And he discovered what is called the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve shows that most amount of forgetting happens immediately after learning. You can try it yourself. Like what you learn in this semester, immediately after the semester, after your exam, you remember most of what you learned. You're able to talk to your classmates, discuss and say, for this question, what did you do? Or even the questions itself. You know, what was this question? Oh, there was this question on the exam. What did you do about that? What did you write? And things like that. After a week, you remember fewer of those questions. After a month or so, you probably don't remember anything, or you may remember just one of those questions. So the forgetting curve has been replicated multiple times, and researchers have seen that the forgetting curve that Ebbinghaus discovered is true about every single person. Another person to remember in the context of cognitive psychologists is Bartlett. What did Bartlett do? Bartlett showed us that memory is not objective. You remember we talked about accuracy and inaccuracy, whether our mind processes information accurately. So what Bartlett did was, in order to study whether memory is accurate or not, he created a story called The War of the Ghosts. It may be, your book may have the story, or it's very easy. You can just look it up and it's all over the internet. It's a story in which you can also try it. So it's like the story starts with, like he tells people that, let me tell you the story actually. So there are 2 people and they go towards the ocean to hunt for seals. When they go there, they see, a canoe with people approaching them. So they are afraid because these are new people. And so they run behind the bushes to hide. But those people who approached them in the canoe, they come towards them, they find them, and they say, listen, you have to come with us. We have to go to the other side of this, river, and where we have to fight with some people. So one of these guys says that, look, I have no arrows, so I cannot come with you. Plus, my relatives don't know about me, and so I need to go home. So they turn to the other guy and say, okay, you come with us. And the other guy goes with them. So the other guy goes to the other side of the water, and they have a battle there. They have a war. And at one point, one of these people tells this man that, hey, you've been shot. Let's go back home. But he's not feeling anything. So he comes back home. When he comes back, he tells his people the story. He says, I think they were ghosts. that I was fighting because they said that I was shot, but I wasn't shot. And he tells him the story, the whole story. So this was the end of the story. Now, can one of you repeat the story for me? We can check and see what Bartlett found, if that happens here again or not. Yes, one of you just tell me the story. What happened?
There's a group of people,
Mhm.
and they are meant to have some sort of battle with some other incoming unidentifiable people because they're new, so they're perceived as dangerous. One person like refuses to join, something about like their family doesn't know what's going on, and they don't have any arrows, so they leave, and then the rest of them go like across a river to go into battle. And then I guess like sort of like the main character of the story gets told that he's been shot, but he doesn't feel, and even though he doesn't feel anything, they make it back home, they leave the battle, and he proceeds to tell his family about having been shot and says that he feels like he was fighting with ghosts.
Okay. All right. So Jalen told us a part of the story. Is there anything that Jalen missed? Does anybody have anything to add to her story?
There's one person that said he couldn't go to war with them because he didn't have arrows.
She said that. Anything else? Or did Jalen change the story in any way? How did they go?
With canoes.
Okay. And why were there in the first place at the water?
To hunt for seals, like to try to get some food. I don't know.
To get some food?
Like to hunt seals, right? This was the main
Okay.
idea.
All right.
Oh
All
my
right.
gosh, I didn't remember any of that.
Yeah. So what Bartlett found was, Ethan, you're very, very attentive. Good. So what Bartlett found was, you see, Jalen remembered a lot of details, right? She said about the arrows. She said about, that the family, they don't know about it. So Bartlett found when he told the story to people from different cultures, many people either, just drop certain details like Jalen did. All right, she dropped the initial part of it. She dropped the part about how they went to the other side. So some details, why? Because she just thought that they're unnecessary. She set the main points. Ethan added something, but Bartlett also found that people tend to substitute. Like Ethan said it, he also substituted, but he also said the correct thing. He said they went looking for food. That's what Bartlett also found, that a lot of people forget, they don't say that these people went hunting for seals. Ethan said it, but most people just say they went looking for fish, they went fishing, or they went looking for food. And then Ethan mentioned canoes. A lot of people substitute and say boats instead. So Bartlett found that memory is not an objective replication of, whatever happens. Memory is constructed and it's reconstructed. So that means when we hear things that people are telling us also, we interpret things while we are storing it, and while we are retrieving it also, we add our own details. The details that we add depend on our culture. So memory is reconstructive. and we add details with the knowledge that we have. So this was important. This was something important that Bartlett contributed. A third figure to contribute to early cognitive psychology was Piaget. You will learn about Piaget's theory when you do a course on developmental psychology. Piaget did a study on his own children. He wanted to see how children's cognitive development takes place. He came up with a lot of details just through observation of his children. For instance, he came up with the concept of object permanence, saying that until the age of 2, children are not capable of thinking that things exist if they're out of sight. So that's why if their mother is leaving for work, a child who is under 2 will have to be distracted by somebody and the mother would have to sneak out and go. But after the age of 2, the child knows that if the mother goes, she's going to come back. So the mother can say goodbye to the child and go. That's called object permanence. So before that, the child thinks if the mother is out of sight, the mother is gone forever. So also sizes, like when you pour, say you pour you pour milk for children. If you pour milk in a tall, thin glass, the child is likely to think that it's a lot of milk you're giving the child. The same amount of milk, if poured into a broad, short glass, the child may cry and say you're giving the child very little milk. Why? Because the child is not capable of understanding volume yet. So also with older children, say a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, if a child does something today and then you say, okay, you're not going to go on your play date at the end of the week. At the end of the week, the child is happy saying, Mom, it's Saturday, so I have my play date today. You tell the child, no, on Wednesday, you remember? You did this, and I told you no play date, so no play date today. And the child wails and cries. You think you're doing a great job, but a 6-year-old cannot make those connections yet. Hypothetical situations like what you do today is connected to what is going to happen on the weekend. The child needs to be slightly older for that. So if you're giving a punishment, it has to be immediate. The child is not going to learn any connection between now and later. So these are things that Piaget brought to psychology through the observation of his children. So that's how cognitive psychology came into existence. Modern cognitive psychologists, you can see here. So we have Kahneman, we have Miller, we have Brodmann. They, contributed different things. Kahneman was actually an economist. So he wasn't a psychologist, but he talked about decision making, about how people make decisions, how we can make wrong decisions based on, how people make right decisions, how people make wrong decisions. What is it that we, focus on? So he is the person who came up with what is called the dual process model of thinking. He said that human beings engage in 2 types of thinking. There's system 1, which is fast, automatic, emotional, and system 2, which is slow, effortful, and logical. So he said most decisions that we make rely on the first type. That is, in everyday life, most of our decisions are system 1 decisions. What to have for breakfast? You immediately decide. What to do about this? You immediately decide. That's system 1. But which major to pursue? That's system 2. You take your time. You deliberate on it. you logically think, and then you make a decision. So that's what Kahneman came up with. Miller, he's the person who talked about the capacity of short-term memory. Why is it that when someone tells you the telephone number, you either have to keep repeating it to remember it? Say you want to call customer service. You look up the number, you keep repeating it until you tap the number on your phone. Or you have to keep looking at it. You look at the first 3 numbers, you go back, look at the next 3. So why is that? Because the capacity of our short-term memory is short. How much is it? Miller said it's 7 plus minus 2. That's the average range. Some of us is 7 minus 2. That means only 5 bits of information. 5 digits, 5 numbers. If someone tells you, you can immediately repeat it. But more than 5 numbers, you may have difficulty. But until 9 is normal. That means some people have a short-term memory capacity of 9 units, 9 things. So if I give you 9 words, some of us may be able to recall the 9 words, but some of us may only recall 5 words. 5 to 9 is normal. More than 9, you have an excellent capacity. So Miller came up with that number, and that was also replicated. You can do it multiple times with yourself or with people, and you'll see it's always the same thing. People just remember 7 bits plus or minus 2. Broadbent came up with the concept of attention. So he said, well, we use our sense organs for getting information, but the information that gets processed is the information that you focus on selectively. So he came up with the concept of selective attention. He said, if you focus attention on something, that finds its way to memory. If you don't focus attention, then you will not remember it. So you see, these are the modern cognitivists. What terms do we use in cognitive psychology? Well, we use the term short-term memory, which has been changed now to working memory, long-term memory, schemas. What's a schema? Schema is a pattern of thinking. A pattern of thinking, sometimes it's a physical schema, like, oh, it's snowing, so I need to wear my boots. It's raining, I need to carry an umbrella. These are physical schemas. But we also have schemas, social schemas about people. You know, for instance, what to do to make your parents happy, what not to do, because you know that if you do that, they are going to be unhappy. So it's a schema, it's a pattern of thinking that we have. So also, now the example here says we have scripts, schemas and scripts. You know, when you enter a library, for instance, you're not supposed to talk loud. So also, you know, when you enter a restaurant, whether you can go and sit down and eat before paying, or whether you should place your order and make the payment before you get your food. You know it. When you enter the restaurant, you know what kind of restaurant it is. So these are things that we store in mind. They're called schemas because they're patterns of thinking associated with specific situations. Today, we have a field called cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience is a combination of cognitive psychology and biology. Biology of the brain, which is neuroscience. We have behavioral neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. So this is where, we use a lot of techniques now. Well, technology has advanced. We can study the brain. We can measure the brain, areas of the brain. We can measure the thickness of tissues in the brain. If they are related to functioning of the brain, we are able to tell. We know what is normal thickness, what is normal functioning. For instance, a person, say, diagnosed with ADHD, we know which part of the brain is underactive. If a person is depressed, we know which part of the brain is underactive. If a person is addicted, we know which part of the brain is overactive. So how do we know that? Because of these neuroimaging techniques that we use. fMRI, what it stands for, F just stands for functional. A regular MRI only gives us information about the size of organs, the structure of organs. The F means functional, so it shows the activity within the brain. A PET scan, PET, it stands for positron emission tomography. Now, PET scans show metabolic activity. Again, it shows you whether the neurons are active or not. Now, how do they show it? We're going to be learning about it when we do the biological psychology chapter. Right now, you just need to know these names. Electrical activity is recorded by EEG. TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is stimulation. That means we can actually stimulate parts of the brain to stop it from being active. And then we can study and see if there's a change in people's behaviors. We can use TMS to activate certain parts of the brain, to disrupt activity and to activate. So you can see that with brain imaging, we are able to study brain in relation to behavior. So cognitive psychology, the fifth school, if you start with Wundt's structuralism, but when you think of the forces, the first force is the Freudian psychodynamic psychology. The second force is behaviorism. Cognitive psychology is not called an independent force because it came right after behaviorism and also teamed up with behaviorism. So today we have what is called cognitive behaviorist perspective. Cognitivism and behaviorism both are together in one school of psychology. So what do we have now? You can see it says it's now the dominant paradigm. So for a long time, the paradigm was psychodynamic. For 60 years, as I said. So Freudian ideas were dominant. But after behaviorism and after especially cognitive psychology and behavioristic views, they became one, and now they are the dominant paradigm. That means most psychologists now adhere to cognitive psychology. They believe that people's interpretations are important. Environmental stimuli are important. The brain is important. So you can see all three: environmental factors, interpretation and processing of information, and brain mechanisms. All three are being considered in cognitive psychology. Lastly, we have sociocultural psychology. So the realization that culture matters also came to be important. So people may interpret things differently. Why do they interpret things differently? It's because of their social and cultural context. What is social? Social is just people around you can affect your behavior. Sometimes, you're with a group of friends. Your friends say, let's do something. You want to do something else, but then you say, okay, it's all right.
By 10 p.m. All classes should
Al-
arrive Thursday by 10 p.m.
Sorry about that. So, you say, okay, I'll do what everyone else wants. You conform to your peer group. Attraction, what you find attractive depends on, again, people around you. People can persuade you to do things. People can influence you to change your way of thinking. That's social psychology. When we talk about people, We're talking about people around you at the moment. Cultural psychology is your background, how you were raised. So your way of thinking, your attitudes, your values, norms, what you think is normal, what you think is abnormal, all that goes back to the way you were raised. So sociocultural psychology is important. There are differences in culture. Personal space, for instance. How close do you sit, to a person? Like in class, in individualist cultures, you'll see that people tend to sit, apart from each other. Unless there's really no space, you may take the chair next to another person and sit down. Otherwise, you prefer to have a chair, vacant between you and the other person when you don't know the person. Eye contact. In the West, we learned that when you're talking to people, you need to maintain eye contact. But you'll be surprised that there are cultures where eye contact is considered rude. So if you're talking to people in authority, or you're talking to a person of the opposite gender, it's the norm for you to look away, to look at the ground, or just look away when you're talking to the person, not to make eye contact. Emotional expression. In some cultures, physical contact is the norm in your greeting. In some cultures, you just maybe shake hands. In some cultures, you might hug. But then there are other cultures where the hug is really a body-to-body hug with kisses, even to strangers. So greeting rituals also can be different. So we know that there are differences across cultures, and what we call a norm is a normal way of behaving. When we say behaving, it means observable behavior, thinking, feeling. So values are different across cultures. Now, when you think about cultures, even though there are various cultures, we tend to think of two categories of cultures: individualistic and collectivist. So in the West, most cultures are individualistic, where the person is important, competition is important, individuals' achievement is important. But in collectivist cultures towards the Middle East, the East, and also in South America, you'll see the emphasis is more on the group. What you do that benefits the group is important. Feeling belonged is important. How others feel is important, not just how you feel. So you can even, test it out by asking people, okay, what kind of person are you? You'll see that people in the West tend to come up with adjectives that are very individualistic. It's about their own personal traits. But when you ask people from a collectivist culture, when they describe themselves, they tend to use words that will immediately be associated with other people. Cultural differences in memory, we already talked about this. Cultural differences in emotional expression. Like in many cultures, you're not expected to show your emotions. But in some cultures, showing your emotion openly is expected. Sometimes there are gender differences. Women are permitted, or it's a norm for women to show their emotions, but for men, it may be considered, like wrong, or it may be just discouraged. Men should not show their emotions. They should be strong. So again, these are values. So people in the context of sociocultural psychology, these are the people. Again, Festinger is very important among these people. Well, we will be focusing, Schachter is also important. Well, they're all important for different reasons, and we will be focusing on their contributions in, different chapters. So what is it that this kind of psychology has contributed to our way of thinking? Now we know that people from different cultures may view the same thing differently because of their background. So we have learned to be open-minded. We have learned, or we try not to be racist, not to be prejudiced, to be open-minded. So this is something that we are trying to cultivate in us. We also know that theories that are developed based on research done on Western populations cannot automatically be applied to, say, people from South America. Why? Because we know that their culture is different. So if we want to apply the same findings, we'll have to redo the research on, say, Spanish-speaking people in South America. So it's of academic importance. Again, this is just a repetition saying that social cultural psychologists have shown us that culture-specific patterns are important. Social influences, cultural influences are important. Okay, once again, this table shows you what we've already gone through. I can skip that. I think comparing the schools also, now you know that the difference between each of these schools. Every school has contributed something to our way of thinking today. Every school developed based on the limitations of the previous school. So you can see structuralism led to functionalism, functionalism to behaviorism, behaviorism to cognitive psychology, cognitive to sociocultural. So just as we were discussing. So we know how historically each of them were important, because while each school contributed something, they also had a problem that the next school tried to take care of. Here again, early psychology, modern psychology. Well, today we focus on the different genders. We focus a lot on groups that were neglected previously, like women. In fact, regarding psychologists, more women are psychologists today than men. But what are the areas that are still under-researched? So we still need to do research on people of color, LGBTQ individuals. Why? Because these individuals have been recently recognized. And so we can't, whatever research has been done on other groups of people, we cannot just transfer those or generalize those to people with disabilities or people with non-Western perspectives, people of color. The glass ceiling effects, that's about women, like women, a lot of women experience what is called a fear of success. As they go up the academic ladder, as they become more successful, there is a perspective that they may be viewed as masculine. And so a lot of women don't like going above a certain level of success. Why? Because they're afraid that they may be considered masculine, or they may be blamed for not taking care of their womanly affairs like the family. So that's the glass ceiling effect. Coming back to the original questions, so this is just to reiterate that the same questions are being considered now. But instead of saying, is it nature or nurture, we now agree that it's both. Similarly, for free will and determinism, we know that it's both. There are behaviors that we intentionally engage in. There are also behaviors that we engage in, but we're not aware of the causes. We know that we are not accurate processors of information. We know about various biases now. So a lot of cognitive biases have been identified regarding conscious versus unconscious. We know, again, both conscious elements and unconscious elements determine our behavior. Differences and similarities. We know that there are common features across all of us because we're human, all of us because we belong to one specific culture. So people from one cultural background do show similarities, but at the same time, individuals also differ from the rest of the group. So in modern psychology, we use the integrative approach. What this means is that we believe in different levels of explanation. We believe that there is the biological level, there is the behavioral level, there is the cognitive level. So that means a person can be treated for depression just through medication, because the medication takes care of, say, neurotransmitters. People can be treated through some behavior therapy by modifying the consequences of their behaviors. People can be treated using cognitive therapy. So you can see each of the therapeutic methods from each school can be still used. Psychodynamic psychology, even though the original Freudian theory is not acceptable, but we do have people who follow a kind of modified psychodynamic theory today. So there are psychodynamic therapies still available. There is sociocultural therapies or interventions available for various problems. So this is just about how integration works with one example of depression. So if it's biological, behavioral, so we have the multiple levels. So also for aggression, you can see multiple levels. A person may be aggressive because they have the genetic tendency to be so. They may be aggressive because of an imbalance in their neurotransmitters or hormones. Person may be aggressive because of the past experiences they've had. Maybe because of socioeconomic factors, they're aggressive. Maybe they learned it as the norm in their culture. So you can see, just like with depression, with aggression or any other concept, any other behavior also, we can have all these various levels. What you need to remember are the various levels: biological, individual, social, and cultural. So when you say individual, it's the behavioristic and the cognitive view. So currently, yes, neuroscience is a big thing now. That means we are making a lot of progress in studying the brain and how that contributes to human behavior. At the same time, we have cultural psychology as an independent group. So, just as important as neuroscience is, cultural psychology is also important. These are the various fields in psychology that are developing really fast. Applied, well, we always had applied fields like clinical psychology, but we are adding technology-based psychology now with a lot of apps, digital, therapy through video conferencing. So this is a new thing, which, gained acceleration, especially after COVID. So once again, things are just being repeated here, saying that we are focusing on cultural differences. Okay, so here are the main questions that we focus on today. What do genes do? How do they interact with the environment? Why is therapy effective? So we need a theory to explain all therapies. Are there any cultural differences in brain function? When we process information differently, brains functioning differently. So where are the differences? Can we treat mental illness more effectively? How does society shape individual psychology? So that's about the impact of culture. So these are questions that psychologists are currently focusing on. Okay, any questions on this part of the chapter? So now you have your first quick. Yes, Alia?
Based on these, well, I also know that it's gonna be, this recording just like last time. We'll see seen in the Bright Space. But what